My name is Elena Brooks. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I was known for being steady, dependable, the kind of woman people described as strong because I didn't ask for much, and lucky because I didn't complain. I was a wife, a project manager, the person who remembered birthdays, paid bills on time, and kept conversations calm when others raised their voices. If you asked people back then how they saw me, they would have said I was composed, practical, a little quiet, someone who could be relied on but rarely noticed. I learned early how to make myself easy to live with, easy to underestimate. I wasn't invisible in a dramatic way. No one ignored me on purpose. I was simply assumed. My presence was treated like infrastructure, useful, necessary, not remarkable. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing someone or winning in a public way. It's not a warning either. It's a record. A clear, honest account of what happens when betrayal meets patience, and patience slowly turns into clarity. I want to be very clear about that from the beginning, because stories like this are often framed as spectacle. Someone is wronged, someone is punished, and the ending is loud enough to feel satisfying. That's not what this is. What happened to me unfolded quietly over time. The real turning points weren't arguments or discoveries that shattered rooms. They were moments so small that no one else noticed them, but they changed the direction of my life. This is the story of my husband cheating, yes. But it's also the story of what came after I stopped asking to be chosen. When he chose someone else, I didn't compete. I didn't beg. I didn't collapse. I chose myself. And I did it in a way that surprised even me. You won't hear dramatic confrontations here. You won't hear me paint anyone as a villain. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in truth. How disrespect often arrives quietly, how people normalize it without realizing they're shrinking, and how power doesn't always announce itself when it returns. If you stay with me through this story, you'll hear about the version of me people thought they understood, and the version they never saw forming. You'll hear how silence can be mistaken for weakness, and how preparation often looks like nothing at all. Most of all, you'll hear how loss doesn't always belong to the person who was left. I'm telling this now because there are many women and men living in the pause before their own clarity, still hoping something will change, still believing loyalty will eventually be rewarded. This isn't advice. It's simply one path, one honest account of how choosing yourself doesn't always feel brave in the moment, but it changes everything. So before we go any further, let me ask you gently, have you ever felt taken for granted? Not because you were loud or difficult, but because you were too reliable to be questioned. Before anything broke, before there was betrayal or distance or names I didn't yet know, I had a role, not one I chose out loud, but one that settled onto me gradually, like dust you stop noticing on furniture you use every day. To my husband, I was stability. That's the word he used when friends asked about our marriage. Stable, reliable. Elena keeps everything running, he would say, half smiling, as if I were a well-designed system rather than a person. I handled our schedules, our finances, and our long-term plans. I remembered the names of his coworkers' spouses, sent thank you notes after dinners, and made sure his parents' birthdays never passed unnoticed. At work, I was the same, the calm one in meetings, the person who absorbed chaos and turned it into timelines. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but I was the one people turned to when something needed to be fixed quietly, without attention. My supervisors trusted me. My colleagues depended on me. Few of them really knew me. Friends described me as low maintenance. They meant it as a compliment. I didn't ask for much. I didn't create drama. I listened more than I spoke. When someone canceled plans, I understood. When someone forgot something important to me, I explained it away before they had to. This wasn't martyrdom. It's important to say that. I wasn't suffering in silence, imagining myself as noble. I genuinely believed this was adulthood, that this was what being strong looked like. I had learned, over time, that if you made yourself useful enough, reasonable enough, you became indispensable. But indispensable is not the same as cherished. In our marriage, I was the constant, the person who would still be there no matter what kind of day he'd had, what mood he was in, or how distracted he became. I adjusted myself without thinking, my tone, my expectations, my timing. If he was stressed, I stepped back. If he was distant, I filled the space with normalcy. People didn't mistreat me. That's the subtlety of it. There was no cruelty anyone could point to, no raised voices, no insults, just an assumption that I would accommodate, that I would wait, that I would understand. And because nothing was wrong enough, I never questioned it. I remember dinners where conversation drifted around me, not through me. I was included, technically, asked questions, nodded at, but rarely invited into the center of things. When decisions were made, about vacations, about social plans, about priorities, I was consulted after the fact, not before. I told myself this was a partnership. Not needing to fight for attention was a sign of security. I wore my emotional restraint like proof of maturity. Looking back, I can see how well I played my part. I didn't demand reassurance, so none was offered. I didn't insist on presence, so absence became normal. I made it easy for people to believe I was always fine. There's a particular danger in being competent and calm at the same time. People stop checking in. They stop asking if you're caring too much. They assume that because you haven't complained, there's nothing to address. My husband believed I would always be there, not because he was cruel, but because I had never shown him a version of myself that might leave. I had never made my limits visible. And so, in his mind, I became permanent. That was who I was to them, the permanent one, the reliable structure, the woman who would adapt rather than disrupt. I didn't see it as invisibility then. I saw it as being trusted. But trust, when it's one-sided, slowly turns into something else, something quieter, something heavier. At the time, I didn't feel angry. I felt settled, safe even. I believed I knew my place, and I believed that place was secure. I had no idea how fragile that assumption really was. The first moment I remember didn't feel important at the time. That's what makes it dangerous in hindsight. It arrived without drama, without tension, and without witnesses who would later remember it with me. It was an evening in early autumn. We were supposed to meet friends for dinner. Nothing special, just a casual plan made a week earlier. I had finished work late, but still made it home in time to change to look presentable without trying too hard. I remember standing in the hallway, adjusting my coat, feeling oddly prepared for something simple. My husband came in late, not late in a rushed, apologetic way, late in a distracted way. His phone was in his hand, his attention split between the screen and the room. He glanced at me and said almost absently that he was exhausted and didn't feel like going out anymore. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't ask if I still wanted to go. He said it as a conclusion, not a discussion. I paused, just for a second, long enough to consider whether this was a moment worth marking. I could have said something. I could have reminded him that we'd committed to plans, that I had rearranged my evening, that this mattered to me. The words hovered somewhere behind my ribs. Instead, I nodded. I said, "Okay, we can stay in." And that was it. The moment passed. He relaxed immediately, already moving on, already relieved. He didn't notice the shift inside me because it was so small it barely registered even to myself. Our friends went without us. I sent a polite message explaining we were tired. No one questioned it. No one ever does when you've built a reputation for being reasonable. That night, we ate leftovers on the couch. He scrolled through his phone. I watched a show I wasn't really interested in. Everything looked normal from the outside. But something had changed, and I didn't yet have language for it. It wasn't that he canceled plans. People do that. It was the way my presence in the decision felt optional, as if my time were a flexible resource rather than something shared. What unsettled me most was how quickly I had erased my own reaction. I didn't feel hurt in a sharp way. I felt edited, like a line removed from a paragraph without anyone noticing the difference. In the days that followed, I replayed the moment occasionally, not obsessively, just enough to feel a faint discomfort. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking, that long marriages were built on compromise, not keeping score. I didn't mention it to anyone. There was nothing to mention, really. If I had tried to explain it out loud, it would have sounded petty. So I folded it inward and moved on. That's how small cuts work. They don't demand attention. They wait. A week later, something similar happened. A conversation was interrupted. A decision made without me. A joke that landed just slightly at my expense, followed by a smile that suggested I was supposed to find it harmless. Each time, I responded the same way, with grace, with understanding, with silence, and each time, I felt that same subtle dislocation. Not pain, exactly. More like being shifted half an inch to the side of my own life. Everyone else ignored these moments. Why wouldn't they? I did too. There was no argument to point to, no wrongdoing to correct, nothing that required an apology. But I noticed something else. How quickly my husband adjusted to my compliance, how natural it became for him to decide first and inform later, how little resistance it took for a pattern to form. Patterns don't announce themselves, they begin as exceptions. I started to pay attention, not in a suspicious way, not yet. just in the way you notice a draft in a room you've always assumed was sealed. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. I didn't change my behavior outwardly at all. But somewhere inside me, a quiet record began. And once you start noticing what gets recorded, you can never fully go back to not seeing it. What followed wasn't a collapse. It was a smoothing over, a gradual adjustment that made everything look fine, while something important was being worn down underneath. Once that first small cut healed over without anyone acknowledging it, the others came more easily. They blended into daily life. A changed plan here, a decision made elsewhere and delivered to me already finalized. A conversation that ended before I finished my thought. None of it was hostile. That was the part I kept clinging to. There was no anger in his voice, no deliberate cruelty, just efficiency, momentum, a sense that things moved faster when he didn't have to slow down and include me fully. I told myself this was temporary. Stress at work, fatigue, the natural ebb and flow of long relationships. I had explanations ready before the questions even formed. When he forgot something important to me, I reminded myself of all the things he remembered. When he seemed distant, I told myself closeness didn't need to be constant to be real. I became very good at balancing the evidence, always in favor of normalcy. The truth is, I had learned long ago how to make myself smaller without feeling like I was disappearing. I framed it as maturity, as patience, as being the kind of partner who didn't make everything about her feelings. So when he interrupted me mid-sentence and changed the topic, I let it go. When he checked his phone while I was speaking, I paused until he looked up again, then continued as if nothing had happened. When he made plans that affected both of us and told me afterward, I adjusted my schedule. I told myself I was choosing peace. What I didn't admit was how often I swallowed the urge to say, "That matters to me." How often I decided it wasn't worth the potential discomfort. I didn't want to be the person who complained about invisible things. There's a particular loneliness in that choice. You're surrounded by people, engaged in routines, maintaining relationships. But you're also constantly negotiating with yourself about what's acceptable to feel. Friends saw us as solid, comfortable. We didn't fight in public. We laughed easily. If anyone had asked me whether I felt disrespected, I would have been genuinely confused by the question. Because disrespect, when it's subtle, doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like being gently edged out of frame. I noticed how often I anticipated his needs and moods, and how rarely the reverse happened. I noticed that my flexibility had become an expectation rather than a kindness. And still, I stayed quiet. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I was afraid of being too much, too sensitive, too demanding. I had internalized the idea that strong women didn't require reassurance, that asking for consideration was a sign of weakness. So I normalized what should have been questioned. I remember one evening when he canceled another plan, this time something I had been looking forward to for weeks. I felt the disappointment rise, sharper than before. It surprised me. I almost said something. Instead, I smiled and said, "It's fine. We can do it another time." He accepted that answer with relief so immediate it told me everything. My acceptance had become the solution. That night, Lying awake beside him, I realized something quietly devastating. He had no idea what it cost me to be easy. And worse, he no longer needed to. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't plotting. I was still trying to preserve what I believed we had. I still believed that if I stayed steady, things would rebalance. But normalization is powerful. Once you accept a certain level of disregard, it becomes the baseline. Anything better feels like a bonus. Anything worse is excused as an exception. I had trained everyone around me, including myself, to believe I required very little. And so I received exactly that. Looking back, this was the phase where my silence stopped being neutral. It began to participate. I was still present, still kind, still functional, but a quiet question had started to form beneath everything else. If this is what being valued looks like, why do I feel so absent from my own life? There is a moment, not dramatic, not cinematic, when you realize that the people around you are interacting with a version of you that no longer feels yours. For me, that realization arrived not as a shock, but as a quiet recognition. I began to see the role I had been given. In my marriage, I was the anchor, the one who kept things steady so others could move freely. My husband talked about his ambitions, his frustrations, his ideas. I listened. I supported. I adjusted my expectations around the weight of his focus. When he was preoccupied, I made space. When he was absent, I filled in the gaps with normalcy. No one explicitly asked me to do this. That's the nature of assigned roles. You step into them because they seem necessary. And by the time you question them, everyone else has already accepted the casting. At work, it was similar. I was the reliable constant. The person's projects were built around. When someone else missed a deadline, I absorbed the pressure. When something went wrong, I fixed it quietly. Praise came in the form of trust, not recognition. Responsibility without visibility. Even socially, I noticed how conversations bent. I was the listener, the stabilizer, the one people turned to when they needed grounding, not excitement. If I spoke, it was to smooth, to clarify, to help. None of this felt wrong on its own. In fact, it felt familiar. I had been praised for these qualities my entire life. Being dependable had become my identity. What unsettled me was the absence of curiosity about me, about what I wanted, what I was tired of, what I was becoming. I realized that my husband didn't really ask me questions anymore, not meaningful ones. He assumed my answers, assumed I availability, assumed my agreement. When plans changed, I was informed. When decisions were made, I adapted. When something inconvenienced me, I minimized it before anyone else had to. The role was clear, reliable, useful, invisible. And because I performed it well, there was no reason for anyone to imagine I might step out of it. The most difficult part of this realization was acknowledging my own participation. I had taught people how to treat me by never correcting them. I had made it easy to overlook me by smoothing over every moment that might have demanded attention. I didn't feel resentful yet. I felt misaligned, like I was living in a version of myself that had been edited down for efficiency. One afternoon, I caught myself in a mirror at work, standing in a conference room after everyone else had left, gathering papers that weren't mine. The room was quiet, the moment was ordinary, and yet I felt a sudden sharp clarity. This is how they see you, I thought. The one who stays behind. The one who handles what others leave unfinished. The thought didn't make me angry. It made me still. That stillness followed me home. I noticed how my husband spoke to me when he was distracted. Half sentences, assumptions, conclusions delivered without invitation. I noticed how rarely he checked whether I was okay with something, and how often I preemptively made myself okay with it. I began to understand that roles, once established, become invisible to the people benefiting from them. They don't question them. They don't reassess. Why would they? Everything works. But something in me was no longer working. I didn't announce this realization. I didn't challenge it out loud. There was no confrontation, no speech about fairness or unmet needs. Instead, I did something far less noticeable. I started paying attention to myself, to the moments I felt dismissed, to the quiet resentment I had been rebranding as patience, to the energy it took to remain agreeable. I didn't change how I acted, at least not yet. But internally, the narrative shifted. I stopped seeing my role as natural. I started seeing it as assigned. And once you recognize a role as something you're playing rather than something you are, it becomes very difficult to continue performing it unconsciously. That was the beginning, not of rebellion, not of escape, of awareness. The shift didn't happen on a dramatic day. There was no argument, no discovery, no moment that would have looked significant from the outside. In fact, if I tried to explain it to someone else, they might have missed it entirely. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because nothing about that day was different. I woke up at the usual time, made coffee, read a few emails before work. The house was quiet in the way it always was when two people lived together efficiently rather than intimately. My husband left before me, as he often did. He kissed my cheek out of habit, already reaching for his keys. I stood there for a moment after the door closed, holding my coffee, feeling an unfamiliar stillness. At work, the day unfolded normally. Meetings, deadlines, and small decisions that carried more weight than they appeared to. I did what I always did, listened, organized, smoothed, but something inside me had slowed down. I was less eager to jump in, less invested in making everything seamless. That afternoon, I sat in my car before driving home longer than usual. Not because I was tired, because I was thinking. I realized I was exhausted in a way rest wouldn't fix. Not burned out, not overwhelmed, just empty of something I couldn't name yet. When I got home, the house felt neutral, familiar. He wasn't there yet. I set my bag down, looked around the living room, and had a sudden piercing thought. If I disappeared from this space for a week, how long would it take for anyone to notice what was missing? Not emotionally, practically. The fridge would still be stocked. The bills would still be paid. The routine would mostly hold. The realization landed without drama, but it stayed. Later that evening, my husband came home distracted, talking about his day. I listened, nodded, and responded at the right moments. At some point, he mentioned canceling another plan we had discussed earlier that week. He said it casually, as if it were already settled. I felt the familiar instinct rise, to adapt, to reassure, to make it fine. This time I paused. I didn't confront him. I didn't argue. I simply said, I had been looking forward to that. The sentence was calm, neutral, not accusatory. He looked surprised, not defensive, just caught off guard, as if he hadn't realized there might be something on the other side of his decisions. Oh, he said, we can do it another time. The conversation moved on. He didn't ask more. He didn't explore the feeling. And I didn't push. But something important had happened. I had acknowledged myself out loud. It was a small thing, almost nothing, but the effect on me was immediate. I felt more present, more solid, as if I had stepped back into alignment with my own experience. That night, lying in bed, I realized how long it had been since I had allowed my internal reactions to exist without immediately managing them away. The shift wasn't about him. It was about me, no longer erasing my own responses before they fully formed. I began to notice how often I had been editing myself in real time, softening thoughts, preempting disappointment, smoothing discomfort before it could even register. That Tuesday marked the first time I didn't do that completely. In the days that followed, nothing changed on the surface. I was still kind, still calm, still engaged, but internally something had turned. I started asking myself quiet questions. What do I actually want here? What am I tolerating because it's easier than naming it? What would happen if I stopped assuming my needs were obvious or unimportant? These weren't dramatic questions. They didn't demand immediate answers, but they changed how I moved through my days. I stopped volunteering to absorb inconvenience automatically. I didn't withdraw. I just hesitated long enough to notice my own reaction. And in that space, I felt something unfamiliar but grounding. Agency, not power, not control, just the sense that I existed fully in my own life again. I didn't know then where this shift would lead. I wasn't planning an exit or a confrontation. I wasn't even labeling anything as wrong yet. But I knew this much. Once you stop erasing yourself, even quietly, the world around you starts to feel very different. After that shift, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been automatic, a reflex born of habit and self-editing. I stayed quiet because it felt easier, kinder, more mature. I stayed quiet because I believed harmony depended on it. Now, when I stayed quiet, it was deliberate. I didn't announce this change. From the outside, I looked the same, calm, reasonable, accommodating, but inside, I was no longer smoothing over moments without first noticing what I felt. When my husband spoke over me, I stopped rushing to finish my thought later. I let the interruption stand. When plans shifted, I didn't immediately reassure him that it was fine. I paused. Sometimes I said nothing at all, not as punishment, as data. I was curious to see what would happen if I stopped managing other people's comfort. The answer I learned was nothing, at least at first. He didn't notice, or if he did, he interpreted my quiet differently, as fatigue, as stress, as me being in my head. That misunderstanding gave me unexpected freedom. At work, I did the same. I stopped preemptively fixing problems that weren't assigned to me. I still did my job well, exceptionally even, but I no longer rushed to catch every falling object. I let a few things drop just far enough to be noticed by others. No one accused me of slacking. They simply adjusted. Meetings took longer. Responsibilities redistributed themselves. I observed how quickly systems change when one person stops compensating silently. What struck me most was how often silence was mistaken for weakness. When I didn't react, people assumed agreement. When I didn't object, they assumed acceptance. When I didn't explain myself, they filled in the blanks in ways that suited them, and I let them. This wasn't manipulation, it was a restraint. I wasn't hiding my thoughts. I was choosing when to give them voice. I was learning that not every truth needs to be spoken immediately to be honored. At home, my husband began to talk more, fill the space more. He narrated his thoughts, his frustrations, his plans. I listened, not in the way I used to, anticipating needs and solutions, but attentively, neutrally. I asked fewer questions, offered fewer fixes. I wanted to see him clearly, without my interpretations cushioning everything. I noticed changes I hadn't before. How often he assumed I would adjust. How rarely he paused to check whether I was aligned. How easily my quiet was absorbed into his momentum. None of this made me angry. It made me focused. Silence, when chosen, becomes a lens. I began writing things down, not accusations, observations, dates, patterns, moments where my presence was assumed rather than engaged. The notebook stayed tucked away. No one knew about it. It wasn't evidence. It was clarity. And with clarity came calm. I felt less reactive, not more. Less desperate to be understood, less invested in correcting perceptions. There was something grounding about knowing I didn't need to explain myself in order to exist fully. My husband started interpreting my quiet as distance. He asked once, lightly, if everything was okay. I said yes, and it was true. Everything was okay in a way it hadn't been before. Because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to preserve an image. I was simply paying attention. Silence gave me time. Time to see how dynamics really function without my constant participation. Time to understand where I stood when I wasn't holding everything in place. Others thought I was withdrawing. They thought I was tired. Some probably thought I was being passive. They were wrong. I was becoming deliberate. And once silence stops being fear-based, it becomes very powerful. Not because it controls others, but because it anchors you to yourself. I didn't know yet what I would do with what I was learning. I wasn't preparing to leave or confront or expose anything. I was preparing to understand. And understanding, I was beginning to realize, is the most underrated form of leverage there is. What no one seemed to notice was how much space had opened up once I stopped filling every gap. When you're no longer busy managing everyone else's comfort, time appears. Energy returns in small, precise ways. I didn't announce this shift, and I didn't make dramatic changes. I simply redirected attention. Quietly, consistently, I started waking up earlier. Not to be productive in the obvious sense, but to think, to read, to sit with my coffee without checking anyone else's schedule. I revisited parts of myself I had set aside in the name of efficiency. My curiosity about systems, my interest in financial structure, my instinct for long-term planning beyond immediate stability. At work, I began paying closer attention to numbers. Not just budgets, but flows, where money moved easily, where it stalled, who benefited from which decisions and why. This wasn't new knowledge. I'd always been capable, but now it was focused, intentional. I noticed how often I had deferred credit, how frequently my contributions were absorbed into the team, while others' names rose to the surface. I didn't confront this. I documented it. Emails, project histories, timelines, quite proof of consistency and impact. At home, I became more observant than ever, not suspicious, precise. I noticed when my husband took his phone into another room, noted how often he angled the screen away, how he suddenly guarded his schedule with vague explanations. None of this triggered panic. It simply confirmed patterns that had already been forming. I didn't follow him. I didn't check his messages. I didn't need to. I was no longer trying to preserve an illusion, so I didn't rush to confirm or deny anything. Instead, I asked myself a more useful question. If this relationship were exactly as it appears right now and never changed, would I want to stay? The answer arrived quietly, but it was clear. I also began preparing in ways no one could see. I reviewed our finances carefully, not obsessively, strategically. I made sure I understood every account, every obligation, every long-term projection. I learned which assets were shared, which were individual, and where my leverage actually lay. I didn't move money. I didn't hide anything. I simply became informed. Knowledge, I learned, changes how you breathe. I updated my resume, not because I was planning to leave my job, but because I wanted to know what my options were. I took a few discreet calls, had conversations framed as exploration. Nothing committed, everything intentional. At home, I maintained normalcy, dinners, conversations, politeness. I didn't withdraw affection or escalate distance. That would have drawn attention. The key to preparation is invisibility. People assume nothing is happening when you behave as expected. They assume stability where there is routine. And I had mastered routine. I also paid attention to myself emotionally. I noticed when sadness arose, and I let it pass without dramatizing it. I noticed when anger flickered, and I didn't feed it. I was no longer interested in reactions that burned quickly and left nothing useful behind. I wanted clarity, and clarity requires patience. The most surprising part of this phase was how calm I felt. Not numb, calm, grounded, as if I were finally standing on something solid rather than constantly adjusting to shifting ground. My husband grew more careless as I grew more precise. He talked freely, assumed safety, assumed my quiet meant acceptance. He never asked what I was thinking, and I never volunteered it. Friends saw nothing, colleagues saw nothing. Even I, at times, forgot how much had changed beneath the surface. But every small action I took was aligned with one central idea. I would never again be unprepared in my own life. What they never noticed was that I had stopped living reactively. I was no longer responding to circumstances as they arose. I was positioning myself within them, not to win, not to punish, to be free to choose. And once you reach that point, when your choices are no longer constrained by fear, confusion, or lack of information, you are no longer as powerless as others assume. You are simply quiet. The reveal didn't arrive with shock. There was no moment where the world tilted or my breath caught painfully in my chest. What I felt instead was recognition, as if something I already knew had finally stepped fully into the light. It happened on an ordinary evening. I was alone at home, sitting at the dining table with my laptop open, reviewing our shared calendar while cross-checking a few upcoming expenses. This had become routine, part of my quiet preparation, part of my need to understand the shape of my life as it truly was, not as I wished it to be. I noticed an inconsistency, a recurring block of time marked vaguely, always midweek, always overlapping with something he'd told me was non-negotiable work. On its own, it meant nothing. Patterns, however, rarely exist alone. I didn't confront him. I didn't jump to conclusions. I followed the thread carefully. There were other small things I had already logged without labeling them. A restaurant charge in a part of town he never went to with me. A sudden interest in clothes he'd never cared about before. The way his phone seemed to become an extension of his hand. None of this was new. What was new was my willingness to see it without rushing to explain it away. The confirmation came quietly, almost gently. An email notification appeared on the shared tablet we used at home. Not explicit, not dramatic, just familiar enough to be unmistakable. A name I didn't know, a tone that didn't belong to colleagues or friends. I read it once, then again. There was no spike of adrenaline, no urge to cry. I felt still, as if a question I had been holding very carefully finally had an answer. I closed the tablet and sat there for a long time. What surprised me most was not the betrayal itself, but how little it hurt compared to how much clarity it brought. The confusion lifted instantly. The small cuts, the distance, the assumptions, they aligned into a coherent picture. I didn't feel chosen over. I felt confirmed. He had chosen someone else, yes, but long before that, he had stopped choosing me in small daily ways. This wasn't a rupture, it was a reveal. I didn't gather evidence. I didn't screenshot messages or track movements. I didn't need proof for court or confrontation. I needed understanding for myself, and I had it. That night, he came home late. He spoke casually, asked about my day. I answered calmly, normally. He had no idea that anything had changed. And in a way, he was right. Everything had already changed. I went to bed that night with a sense of peace that startled me. Not relief, not resolve, peace. The kind that comes when uncertainty dissolves and you finally know where you stand. I realized something important in those hours of quiet. Discovery does not require reaction. Knowing does not demand immediate action. I didn't owe anyone a scene. What I owed myself was integrity. I spent the next few days sitting with the knowledge, not numbing it, not dramatizing it, just letting it exist alongside everything else. I observed how he moved through the house, how he spoke to me, how little effort it took for him to maintain the version of reality he assumed was intact. I also observed myself. I noticed that my self-respect didn't collapse, that my sense of worth remained steady, that I didn't feel compelled to compete, compare, or interrogate. The story was already clear. This was not a moment for confrontation. It was a moment for a decision. I understood now that I held something more powerful than evidence or anger. I held clarity without chaos. And that clarity gave me options. Real ones, knowing the truth didn't force my hand. That surprised me. I had always assumed that discovery would come with urgency, decisions demanded, conversations unavoidable. Instead, I found myself standing at a quiet intersection with time on my side. I had options, real ones, and for the first time in a long while, I could evaluate them without fear clouding my judgment. I could confront him immediately, lay everything out, demand explanations, apologies, promises. That path was familiar, culturally approved. It would have given me the illusion of control, even if it changed nothing. I could ignore it, continue as before, pretend nothing had shifted, while slowly dissolving inside. That was the easiest option in the short term and the most expensive in the long run. I could leave quietly, without explanation, detach emotionally and practically, allowing the truth to remain unspoken. That path tempted me with its clean lines, but something about it felt incomplete. Or I could choose something else entirely. I spent days thinking, not obsessing, but weighing. I considered what each option would cost me, not financially, not socially, but internally. I realized that what I wanted most was not vindication, not even honesty from him. I wanted coherence. I wanted my actions to align with my values, to move in a way that preserved my dignity, my stability, and my future, without requiring me to become someone reactive or bitter. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I would not confront him yet. I would not reveal what I knew. I would finish what I had quietly begun. This wasn't avoidance. It was completion. There were practical matters to resolve, legal considerations to understand, professional positioning to finalize. I wasn't seeking advantage. I was ensuring independence. I consulted a lawyer under the guise of general information, asked hypothetical questions, learned timelines, learned options. Knowledge removed the edge from my fear. I continued strengthening my position at work, took on a visible initiative, accepted recognition without deflecting it, not loudly, just firmly. At home, I remained present, kind, engaged. Nothing about my demeanor suggested rupture. If anything, I was calmer than before. My husband interpreted this as stability, as reassurance, as I am being myself again. He didn't know that the version of me he recognized was already out of date. The decision I made wasn't about timing him. It wasn't about strategy for revenge. It was irreversible because it was internal. I stopped waiting for him to choose me. That was the moment. Not when I found out, not when I planned my exit, but when I withdrew the expectation that he would eventually return to me emotionally. I saw him clearly now, not as a villain, not as a mystery, but as someone capable of leaving while staying. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. This decision freed me from negotiation, from hope as a form of delay, from the exhausting labor of emotional anticipation. I no longer wondered what he would do. I focused on what I would do. And that focus brought a surprising sense of calm. I didn't feel powerful in a dramatic way. I felt grounded, certain, as if I had stepped onto solid ground after years of walking on shifting surfaces. The path forward was clear, not easy, but clear. And clarity, I learned, is what makes action possible without chaos. I had reached the point of no return, not because of what I planned to do next, but because of what I would never do again. I would never abandon myself to preserve a version of peace that required my erasure. That decision had already been made. Everything that followed was simply execution. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down and sharpened. I didn't rush. That was the most important part. Rushing would have meant reacting, and I was no longer reacting to my life. I was shaping it. On the surface, nothing changed. Our routines remained intact. We still ate dinner together, still talked about ordinary things, still shared space without tension. If anything, the absence of conflict made our life look even more stable from the outside. That illusion worked in my favor. Behind that calm, I moved carefully, methodically. Every action had a purpose, but none announced itself. I finalized my understanding of our finances. I made copies of documents, not to weaponize them, but to ensure I was never dependent on access controlled by someone else. I organized information the way I always had, clearly, responsibly, without drama. I adjusted small things that no one would notice at first. I redirected part of my income into an account that existed only in my name, not hidden, just independent. I updated beneficiaries, reviewed insurance, quiet acts of adulthood that most people delay because they assume permanence. At work, I accepted a role expansion that came with visibility and leverage. I didn't ask permission at home. I didn't frame it as a discussion. I stated it as information. My husband congratulated me, proud even. He had no idea what that step represented. I also strengthened my support system without revealing why. I reconnected with colleagues and acquaintances under the guise of professional interest. I rebuilt a network I had allowed to narrow over the years. No one suspected anything. Why would they? There was no conflict to point to, no tears, no accusations. Silence protected momentum. Emotionally, I remained steady. I didn't withdraw affection in a noticeable way. I didn't escalate distance. I refused to let my internal clarity turn into external coldness, not because I owed him warmth, but because I owed myself consistency. I wasn't pretending anymore. I was completing a process. There were moments, of course, when the knowledge pressed in on me, small flashes of sadness, a brief sting when I watched him move through the house so comfortably, unaware that the foundation beneath us had already shifted. But those moments passed. What surprised me most was how little energy this phase required. Preparation, when aligned with truth, is not exhausting. Living in denial had cost me far more. Each quiet step I took reinforced a sense of self-trust. I wasn't waiting for permission. I wasn't hoping for change. I wasn't bargaining with reality. I was moving forward. The world around me didn't notice, and that was the point. Because consequences rarely begin with noise. They begin when one person stops holding everything together. I knew that once I stopped compensating, financially, emotionally, structurally, others would eventually feel the shift. They just wouldn't understand it yet. And I was okay with that. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I wasn't trying to be seen as right. I was building a life that no longer required me to stay where I was no longer chosen. Quietly, completely. Consequences don't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes they arrive as an absence. The first signs were subtle enough that no one connected them to me. A missed detail here, a delayed response there. Small disruptions in the rhythm of daily life that had once run smoothly without effort. At home, things stopped aligning automatically. Bills still got paid, but not invisibly. Appointments still got scheduled, but not seamlessly. Social obligations still existed, but someone else had to remember them. My husband noticed, vaguely, that things felt off. He mentioned it once, casually, said he felt distracted, overloaded. I listened. I didn't rush to fill the gaps. At work, the shift was clearer. When I stopped quietly absorbing other people's mistakes, the system adjusted, but slowly. Deadlines stretched. Meetings grew longer. Questions that once landed on my desk began circulating without resolution. People started asking where things stood, not accusatorily, just uncertainly. I answered directly. I provided what I was responsible for. I did not volunteer what I was no longer carrying. The difference between contribution and compensation became visible. And once that difference emerges, it cannot be unseen. Emotionally, I felt something unexpected, relief, not because others struggled, but because their struggle was no longer evidence of my failure. It was simply the result of a system recalibrating without my constant intervention. At home, my husband grew more restless. He asked more questions, not about us, about logistics, about schedules, about things he had once assumed would take care of themselves. I responded politely. Briefly, I did not over-explain. He mistook this for a distraction on my part. Stress at work, perhaps. He told himself a story that allowed him to remain comfortable. That story began to unravel when the convenience he had relied on no longer materialized. It wasn't that I refused to help. I simply stopped preempting. The emotional consequence arrived later. He began to sense distance, not as coldness, but as a shift in gravity. Conversations felt different. I was present, but not anchored to his reactions. I listened, but I no longer absorbed his moods. This unsettled him. People often don't notice your strength until they have to carry their own weight. Friends commented on how calm I seemed, how focused. Some said I looked lighter, more of myself. They couldn't articulate the change, but they felt it. My husband felt it too. But without context, he started reaching for reassurance. Small gestures, questions framed as jokes. "You're quiet lately," he said once, smiling. "Everything okay?" I answered honestly, yes, because it was. The consequences weren't dramatic. They didn't announce themselves. They accumulated. Comfort eroded. Assumptions failed. The ease of being supported without noticing began to disappear. And with it, something else faded. His certainty. Not about me leaving, but about me staying no matter what. That certainty had been the true foundation of our life together. And now, without confrontation or accusation, it was dissolving. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. This was the cost of taking myself seriously, and for the first time, I was willing to pay it. By the time he realized something was wrong, he was already behind the moment. Not behind in the sense of timing, but behind in understanding. The first sign of panic didn't look like fear. It looked like confusion. He began double-checking things that had once simply worked, asked questions he hadn't needed to ask before, paused, mid-sentence, as if waiting for cues that no longer arrived. "What's our plan for next month?" he asked one evening casually. I told him what my plan was. He blinked, not alarmed, just recalibrating. It still hadn't occurred to him that the structure of our life had shifted. He assumed it was temporary, a phase, stress, something that would rebalance itself once things settled down. That assumption was the last thing to go. He began offering small gestures, dinners out, thoughtful comments delivered a beat too late. He paid more attention to my schedule, asked how my day had been, and waited for the answer. I noticed all of it, and I understood something important. Attention, when it arrives only after withdrawal, is not repair. It's a response. He wasn't addressing the cause. He was reacting to the effect. The irony was quiet, but absolute. For years, I had adjusted without acknowledgement. Now, he was adjusting without comprehension. One night, he said, "You feel different lately." I nodded. "How?" he asked. I paused, not to protect him, to respect myself. "I'm clearer," I said. He laughed lightly, unsure what to do with that. About what? About my life? That was the moment he felt it. Not the betrayal being discovered. Not anger. Not confrontation. Loss of access. He tried to move closer emotionally after that. Shared more. Asked questions that hinted at concern without naming it. But there was an underlying urgency now, a sense that something essential was slipping beyond reach. What he didn't understand was that this wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a reality to be faced. And it was already too late to fix it in the way he wanted, because what had broken wasn't trust in him, it was dependent on him. I no longer needed reassurance, no longer needed explanations, no longer needed him to choose me. And once that need disappears, gestures land differently. They don't heal. They reveal timing. He was responding to my withdrawal, not my pain. And that distinction mattered. I wasn't closed off. I wasn't cold. I was simply no longer negotiating my worth. He sensed that something irreversible had occurred, even if he couldn't name it. His questions became more direct. His tone is more careful. "Are you happy?" he asked one evening. The question would have undone me once. Now, I answered honestly, "I'm at peace." That frightened him. Peace doesn't invite fixing. It doesn't bargain. It doesn't wait. He had been given years of opportunity to see me clearly, to engage before distance turned into clarity. But comfort had delayed his awareness. By the time he noticed the shift, I was no longer standing where he could reach me emotionally. Not because I had moved away, but because I had moved inward. And that is a distance no one can cross for you. The confrontation, when it finally came, was nothing as people imagine. There were no raised voices, no accusations hurled across a room, no tears demanding answers. If anything, it felt restrained, almost formal, as if two people were finally acknowledging a truth that had been present for some time. It happened on a quiet evening. He asked if we could talk. The tone alone told me he already knew the conversation would not go the way he hoped. We sat at the table where we had shared countless ordinary meals. The setting was familiar. The air was calm. He spoke first. "I feel like I'm losing you," he said. I didn't correct him. I didn't rush to reassure. I let the statement exist. He continued, explaining how distant things felt, how disconnected, how he didn't understand when or why it had happened. He spoke carefully now, choosing words as if they might still change the outcome. When he finished, he looked at me the way someone looks at a locked door, expectant, uncertain. I didn't respond immediately, not to create tension, to remain honest. I didn't disappear. I said finally, I stopped compensating. The room went very still. I told him I knew about the other woman. Not how, not when, just that I knew. The information landed quietly, without accusation. His reaction wasn't explosive. It was hollow, a kind of stunned silence followed by attempts to explain, framed not as justification, but as confusion. He spoke about distance, about feeling unappreciated, about things that just happened. I listened, not to validate the reasoning, but to understand how far apart our realities had been. When he finished, he waited. For anger, for tears, for negotiation. None came. I'm not here to argue, I said, and I'm not here to punish you. That surprised him more than anything else. I explained calmly that what hurt wasn't just the betrayal. It was the years of being assumed, of being steady enough to be overlooked, of being treated as permanent rather than chosen. He tried to apologize then, properly this time. Promised change, promised effort, promised presence. I believed his sincerity, and still it didn't change my answer. Why now? I asked him, not angrily, just clearly. Why only after I stopped holding everything together? He didn't have a response. That was the truth he couldn't avoid. I told him I wasn't interested in rebuilding something that required my silence to survive, that I had already done the work of returning to myself, and I wasn't willing to undo it. There was no triumph in saying that, just finality. He asked if there was anything he could do. I shook my head. Not for us, I said. The conversation ended without closure in the way people expect. No dramatic resolution, no mutual understanding wrapped neatly in forgiveness. Just clarity. When we stood up, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. Not for what had happened, but for the way it ended. Calm, honest, without spectacle. I didn't need him to regret his choices. I needed to respect mine, and I did. After everything ended, people expected a transformation they could see. They expected anger or sadness, worn like armor. They expected me to speak differently, dress differently, rebuild myself in obvious ways. Some waited for bitterness, others waited for relief, loud enough to reassure them that I was okay. What they didn't understand was that the transformation had already happened long before the ending. I didn't need to become someone new. I had returned to someone intact. Life now is quieter, but not emptier. I wake up in a space that reflects my decisions. My days have a rhythm that doesn't revolve around anticipation or adjustment. I no longer ask myself how to be less. I ask myself how to be aligned. At work, I take up space without apology, not loudly, just fully. I speak when something matters to me. I don't soften my contributions in advance. I let my presence be what it is. People respond differently to that. Some step back, some lean in. Both are information. In relationships, I listen, but I also name. If something feels off, I don't normalize it away. I don't assume it will resolve itself if I remain agreeable long enough. I trust my perception. That trust is the real success of this story. I didn't win anything in the conventional sense. There was no public reckoning, No moment where he begged and I refused. No visible proof that choosing myself paid off. And yet, everything changed. I feel steady in a way I never did before. Not because life is perfect, but because my sense of self no longer depends on being needed. I don't confuse usefulness with worth. The most important shift is internal. I no longer abandon myself to preserve comfort. I don't participate in dynamics that require my silence to function. That doesn't make me harsh. It makes me honest. Sometimes, people from my past still describe me as calm, dependable, and grounded. The difference is that now, those qualities serve me as much as they serve others. I am still kind, still thoughtful, still capable of compromise, but I am no longer invisible. I don't chase being chosen. I choose deliberately. And if someone cannot meet me in that space, I don't resent them. I release them. There is a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can leave, not dramatically, not impulsively, but cleanly, with your integrity intact. That confidence doesn't announce itself. It simply changes how you stand, how you speak, how you decide. This is who I am now, not hardened by betrayal, not defined by loss, defined by coherence. There is a version of this story that could have been louder. A version where betrayal is met with fury, where justice looks like exposure, where power is proven through humiliation or public victory. That version is familiar because it's easy to recognize. It gives pain a clear shape and an immediate outlet. But that was never the story I needed to tell. What I learned through this experience is quieter and perhaps harder to accept. Disrespect rarely begins with cruelty. It begins with an assumption, with being relied on so consistently, your presence stops being considered, with silence that is mistaken for strength and strength that is mistaken for permanence. When my husband chose someone else, the loss wasn't mine alone. It was mutual, but asymmetrical. I lost a relationship that no longer reflected me. He lost access to someone who had held his life together without demanding recognition. I didn't take anything from him. I simply stopped giving what had been taken for granted. Choosing myself didn't look like confrontation. It looked like preparation, like patience, like refusing to rush clarity for the sake of comfort. Success, in this context, isn't about thriving visibly. It's about standing in your life without negotiation, about knowing that if everything familiar disappeared tomorrow, you would still recognize yourself. There is a quiet power in not needing to be chosen once you've chosen yourself, not because it makes you untouchable, but because it makes you honest. If there is a moral here, it's not about leaving at the first sign of discomfort or about enduring endlessly in the name of loyalty. It's about paying attention to what your silence is costing you. Because silence is not neutral. It either protects you or it erases you. And the moment you realize which one it has become, you have a responsibility to yourself, not to react, to decide. I don't regret how I handled this. I don't regret the restraint, the quiet, the absence of spectacle. I moved in a way that allowed me to walk away without carrying someone else's shame or anger as my own. That, to me, is emotional justice. If this story resonated with you, I want to ask you something. Not as a call to action, but as a moment of reflection. Where in your life are you being counted on so completely that no one is checking whether you still want to be there? And what might change if instead of waiting to be chosen, you chose yourself calmly, clearly, and without apology? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.